of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, which is a public university in the south of the United States. I have been there for 20 years, and I run a relatively new institution there called the Authoritarian Politics Lab, in which me and my team of graduate students, there's about 10 of us, and a postdoctoral fellow work on problems of authoritarianism around the world, particularly in Russia and Turkey and China, but also in other countries around the world, looking at both the sort of political psychology of authoritarianism, but also anti-authoritarian movements, protest movements, and people standing up for democracy. And this has been essentially what I've worked on for about 20 years. I'm delighted to be here in Kyiv. I'm honored to be invited, and I thank Alina and Professor Brick and Jennifer Mukashvili for inviting me to participate in this course. I'm delighted to see you all here. I know that this is a really tough time, understatement of the year, for many of you, and I really appreciate your willingness to continue to engage with social science and learning, and I really look forward to the conversation we're going to have this morning. I have been working on topics related to Ukraine for some time. I first came to Kyiv in 1995, and it was a different town then, and it's been a real pleasure for me to watch the evolution of Ukraine and of Kyiv in particular over that time. I've been coming back fairly regularly, really since then, and starting again more intensely around 2012. I have been doing survey research primarily in Ukraine, very often with the Razumkov Institute, working very closely with Mikhailo Mishenka at Razumkov, who's been an incredible help in my research. And the data I'm going to show you this morning comes out of that work with Mishenka. It's also co-authored with some scholars in the US, who I'll talk about when we get to that point. I have learned so much from Ukrainians about Ukraine over the years, and what I bring to you is my research and my data as a foreigner, right? So I'm very interested. I'm excited to be here to learn from you guys. You'll see lots of Ukrainians cited in the various slides in the work that I'll present. But there are lots of Ukrainians who are not there, right? Who I mentioned, who I've learned a lot from over the years, and I've always been really struck by the spirit of collaboration and cooperation and intellectual exchange that you get in Ukraine. And I would say, certainly amongst the places that I've studied and worked in for some time, Ukraine is unique in that regard. It's always been a really, really special place. And so it's a real joy for me to be here this morning. What I'm planning on doing is presenting some of my own kind of, what I like to think of as kind of recent cutting edge research. But I want to place that in a broader context of some bigger social problems, some bigger social issues. Usually when we study big social questions in social science, they're kind of too large and unmanageable to really get a handle on. And so what we need to do is focus in on some of the details, more specific questions. And I hope my talk this morning will give you some sense of how that process works and how we do that. So that's kind of the plan. We're going to talk about anti-corruption. We're going to talk about a very specific case of anti-corruption reform, which is the police reform that took place in 2015 and 2016. But I'm going to put that into a broader context of the kinds of dilemmas and problems that anti-corruption reforms require, essentially, in a country like Ukraine, not only Ukraine by any stretch of the imagination, but many, many countries around the world. So what we're going to talk about today is corruption and change, and the issue of how to really radically change social systems and people's ways of interacting with each other and with institutions over hopefully a relatively short space of time. And I think the most important thing to understand about this is that corruption is not a problem of a few bad apples in general, right? It's not a couple of evil people, bad people who are engaged in this process alone. There's certainly plenty of that. But corruption more broadly is a broader social process. It's a set of norms, it's a set of understandings, it's a set of institutions that people become accustomed to and start to operate within those norms and institutions. And so what you need is not just very specific change, but you need broad cultural change. And what I'm going to argue, and in one of the readings that I assigned for this course, if you had a chance to take a look at them, what you'll see is that essentially there's an interaction between people's attitudes and the institutions with which they are engaged in society. And so changing one helps you change the other, right? And it's a circular process, a process of interaction. So one of the questions we have to ask ourselves when we're thinking about how to design anti-corruption programs, how to achieve this large social change, is to think about how is it that large social changes actually happen, right? What are some of the things that we typically associate with large social change to make it possible? And there's a bunch of different characteristics that I'll walk through just now to give you some sense of what these are. And the first is sort of large-scale social and economic changes, big social forces that change over time, that give an impetus to change. And there are a number of different kinds of these. One is changes in technology, technological revolutions that drive changes in how we make things and how we do business, but also change society. So if you think about the Industrial Revolution, and the initial sort of Industrial Revolution when we harness the power of steam and coal, and then move on to kind of mass manufacturing, which takes industry from being in small workshops sort of around cities and in the countryside into huge factories, and then you bring hundreds of thousands of workers into cities, and you build enormous cities like Kiev. This is an industrial, it's a product of industrial change. And then we have the sort of information revolution that sort of leads to deindustrialization around lots of major cities in the West, and now the AI revolution, the artificial intelligence. These kinds of big technological changes drive social change. They make people's relations with their work and with each other very different, right? It can be technological change. It can also be demographic change. So you have youth booms, population booms drive social change all around the world. Big concentrations of young people really change how societies operate. And at the other end of the demographic scale, the graying of the population, the older populations, also force societies into major changes. You think about Japan today and the radical changes that are undergoing, the Japanese society is undergoing because of this aging population and the relative lack of young people. So these are other sources that really push change. And then thirdly, another kind of change is changes in social relations. If you think about the emergence of capitalism out of feudalism, and it utterly changes the nature of power in society from being related to birthright to being related to possession and control of capital, of money, right? Radically changes social relations. These kinds of big, large-scale changes are often accompanied by the sort of deep social change that we're looking for in trying to address corruption. And I'll tie that very directly to events in Ukraine in a moment. The other thing that often accompanies big social change is protest, or what scholars, sociologists tend to call contention. By contention, they mean violence, essentially, of various kinds, large-scale violence, revolutions. Revolutions come in lots of different flavors. So you have the Chinese revolution in the 1930s and 40s is really a peasant revolution, when the peasants rise up and take the cities. And totally transform relations. You have sort of elite-based revolutions like the American Revolution, in which one elite essentially replaces another elite, changes the nature of the governance structure without really changing very much the sort of deep fabric of society. You have urban revolutions. Urban revolutions have become increasingly common around the world. The sort of archetypal urban revolution was the Iranian revolution, the Islamic revolution in Ukraine, where urban citizens overthrow a political regime, usually in the name of anti-corruption, actually. At least that's one of the major themes of urban revolutions we see around the world. And push for dramatic political change. Now, as the Iranian Revolution shows, the dramatic political change is unpredictable, right? And you can end up with something quite different from what you start off trying to achieve, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Contention also comes in the form of war. So defeat in war is something that drives social change. Victory in war, which I'll talk more about tomorrow, actually, but that also drives social change. So the Russian Revolution, both Russian revolutions of 1905 and 1917, very much driven by war, by defeat in war. Transformation of Japan and Germany after the Second World War, that's defeat again in war, and actually also foreign occupation. So this sort of kind of big social change, big economic change associated with contention are two of the big drivers of change within societies. Another important element of this is change in ideas. Often associated with these kinds of political changes are transformative moments in which the past is left behind and a new future is imagined, and you get this kind of struggle between traditionalist thinking, between conservative ideas and more progressive ideas. So you can think of this as being tradition versus the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, being a period in European history, but also, kind of a nice kind of portmanteau term for new and progressive ideas, the ideas of change. And so you have a battle between people who think that things can't really change. They always sort of basically stay the same. This gentleman over there is Joseph de Maistre, who was a French, actually from Savoy in Italy, a thinker, a conservative thinker, railing against the French Revolution, railing against political change. He's very famous for the idea that he wrote that people get the kind of government that they deserve, right? So bad people get bad governments, and good people get good governments, and government is some kind of reward or punishment for the kind of society that you are, right? So it's very static kind of thinking, and you see this both in the major aftermath of the French Revolution, but you see it all the time. This Gabriel Ammon's book from 1963 called The Civic Culture, a very, very famous, very influential book in social sciences at the birth of really empirical social sciences, makes this exactly the same argument, basically, that people who are democratically oriented get democracy and people who are not don't, right? So a very kind of, a very conservative, very hidebound set of ideas, right? The French Revolution, on the other hand, was really founded on the notion that, no, that's not the case at all. That dramatic political change, dramatic social change is possible, and all changes are imaginable, right? This is a really, we think of this as being a kind of voluntaristic set of ideas that people can achieve the kinds of change that they want if they go about it in the right way, if they have the right set of ideas and the right kinds of political technologies, right? Change is possible. The article that I had some of you read for the course, the Martin Angeli et al. Is in this kind of flavor that societies and institutions interact with one another, and you can develop social change in that way. In other words, at times of revolution, at times of big change, you always have people who kind of sigh and say, oh, it'll never change, and people who say, no, absolutely, it can totally change, right? And this possibilism, I think, is a really important part. The imagination, the vision of a different future is a fundamentally key part of broad social change of the kind that we're talking about this morning. Institutions matter enormously. This is the oldest continuous parliament in the world, the Icelandic Alþingi, which this is It used to be outside. This is the Law Rock at Thingvellir. They moved it inside because in Iceland the weather's not really great for outside parliaments. Over 1,000 years old, right? But an institution that evolved over time, like all parliaments have evolved over time. So the transformation of political power from the monarchy to a parliament that was initially an elite parliament, to then a parliament that actually comes to represent citizens, to a parliament that then becomes accountable to citizens. This is a process of institutional change that's also really, really important for developing social change, right? So there's kinds of institutions that go along with economic change, with protest and social mobilization, changes in ideas, then changes in institutions, right? This is all part of this package of radical social change that goes together. But, and this is what I'm really going to end up talking about most today, is that all of these big social forces, they kind of pile on, but the actual outcomes depend on what people do. They depend on how people react to those situations. They depend upon how politicians, reformers, actually act, right? So the example I gave earlier on of the Iranian Revolution, this is a revolution against corruption that's really led by merchants, by people in the bazaar in Tehran, and it gets taken over by a different set of politicians, right? It gets taken over by the Islamists, right? And it takes the revolution in a whole other direction. And so the role of politicians in getting reformers, this is Martin Luther and John Knox and a whole series of Protestant reformers, right? You need these leaders to come forward and actually drive the kind of political change that you need. So that basic setup, social change, protest, ideas, institutions, and leaders should be very familiar to everybody in this room because it's really the history of Ukraine in the last 30 years, right? So we're going to look at anti-corruption in Ukraine. We can trace the story through a similar set of patterns, right? So you have big social change, which is the unraveling of the USSR, the collapse of the Stalinist economic model, right, had been transformative in terms of industrialization, runs into its limits very dramatically, and starts encountering very, very serious economic changes that force the leadership to make policy changes, right? That unleashes a whole set of forces that they had no imagination and no understanding that was going to take place. But the core of it really is the economic changes that were forced upon the leadership due to the failure of the economic model, right? So there's a kind of deep sort of structural change at the heart of this whole story. And then you get contention. You get a series of revolutions all around the former Soviet Union, but particularly in Ukraine, right? In Ukraine, you get the revolution on the granite in 1990, amongst the first really dramatic protests for Ukrainian sovereignty, for Ukrainian independence, and really establishes Ukraine on the political path towards independence that takes place the following year. But we're not done, because Ukraine becomes independent, but the kinds of reforms, the kinds of society that Ukrainians had imagined, Ukrainians had dreamt of at the moment of independence, for all sorts of reasons we could talk about, doesn't emerge. And instead what you get is a political system that's run by oligarchs, that's highly corrupt, and that's produces a society that remains quite poor and increasingly unequal, and generates a lot of dissatisfaction. So Ukrainians take to the streets again in the Orange Revolution in 2004, and refusing to be ruled by Viktor Yanukovych. You'll see a theme here. Take to the streets to protest and demand a clean election. And to demand not just a clean election, but to demand a clean election that's going to lead in their minds to a government that's going to be clean too, that's going to fight for an anti-corruption agenda. This is really Yushchenko's platform, his primary platform, at least when he gets elected. He switches after election like many before, right? But that's what the people on the streets are demanding in 2004. And then in 2013, 2014, the Euromaidan, the Revolution of Dignity, similar agenda, right? Very much based on changing, there's the European path, right, which is what really provokes the protest at the very beginning, but then the understanding of the revolution widens, right? It widens into being an understanding of anti-corruption writ small, but also anti-corruption writ large. The change in the nature of the relationship between the Ukrainian people and their state, right? Very, very, fascinating, because with each of these revolutions, the Ukrainians learn. They learn what went wrong the last time and why the last one didn't produce the kind of change that it required. And they develop new technologies and end up being, the Revolution of Dignity really is an extraordinary event in world history, I think. And if you study revolutions, it's one of the very, very few revolutions in the history of the world where people come to fight a revolution with a very clear plan of what they're intending to do, with a very clear set of ideas, right? This is the platform of reanimation package for reforms. Many of you will be familiar with from just after the Revolution of Dignity. People sat down in the Maidan and actually hashed out reform proposals and agreed on a package, agreed on a set of reforms across society, across the economy, across politics, across the judiciary, the police, the security forces, all these different elements come together to create a revolution that has a clear agenda, has a clear set of things that people are trying to achieve. Right? So there's a radical change in ideas, and also at the time there's also a radical change in how many Ukrainians think of themselves and understand their position, understand their identity. Changes in developing a stronger attachment to Ukraine as a state, to a civic conception of what being Ukrainian means. And there's tons of data on that. I will show some of that data tomorrow. But this is a really huge change in ideas that follows from the contention, that follows from the big social upheavals. And then finally, there's new institutions that get shaped. A whole series of new institutions. This one, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, NABU, designed to be a force, an independent force that really tries to attack, prosecute high-level corruption. But there's also a whole series of new institutions across society, from different forms of how government contracts get run out, the Prozoro, to new ways of running elections, a whole series of institutions that are designed to create the possibility, to create the reality of change. So the Ukrainian example really follows through each one of those steps that you would very often see that accompany a large-scale social change. It's kind of almost like a classical set of conditions. And so it has the same classical set of problems, because at the end of the day, in order to make this stuff happen, you don't have Martin Luther, right? You have politicians. And politicians are people, and politicians are a particular kind of people who respond generally very well to their incentives. They do what's easy. They do what helps them politically. And they respond to constituents. And sometimes those constituents are, the public more broadly, and sometimes those constituents are private interests, wealthy private interests. And so the challenge is to create a situation in which these politicians are going to be responsive to progressive forces, they're going to be responsive to forces that are pushing for, in our case, anti-corruption, rather than feathering the nest and supporting more corrupt influences, right? I remember very well at the time coming to Kyiv in 2014 and interviewing politicians and speaking with Igor Solovyov, who was the chair of the anti-corruption committee in the parliament, at the time and sort of, saying, hey, how's it going? And he said, well, I have a problem. I said, what's your problem? And he said, well, there's 15 people on the anti-corruption committee. There's me and the 14 most corrupt people in Ukraine on the anti-corruption committee, right? And so I have to somehow get these guys to adopt a platform that's going to damage their own interests, right? How do I do that? Right? This is my problem. Tell me the answer. Of course, there is no answer, right? So his approach is based around transparency. It's around holding the meetings of the committee live on television. Then at least if people are going to push for amendments, push for laws that are feathering their own nest, that are protecting their own interest, and are against the public interest, at least they have to do it in public, right? That's the tool, the one tool that I have is transparency and openness. And so the question is how to set up these political incentives to really take down what are deeply entrenched, deeply sophisticated private interests that go against the public welfare. And so the trick is to somehow try and set up reforms that are actually in the interest, or in the economic jargon, are incentive compatible, right? You don't expect your politicians to be saints, in other words, because you'll be disappointed. You have to expect your politicians to respond to incentives. So now I get to the research part, right? This is that's this historical background and the sort of the big train of causation that gets us to the nitty-gritty, down in the weeds work of actually making the small social changes that add up to the big social change, right? How do we get different kinds of reforms? And so I'm going to focus particularly on the political incentives around patrol police reform in Ukraine in the aftermath of the Euromaidan. And we're going to look at the extent to which these kinds of reforms are actually incentive compatible for politicians. And here's the politician's dilemma, right? So you go to a politician and you propose a reform process to them. They're going to make a calculation about what suits their interests. They know one thing for sure. They know that fighting corruption is costly for them politically. It's going to alienate powerful people, and it's going to be sure that they're going to push back against you, right? That you know for sure. So in order to make this calculation, they have to have something on the other side to balance out the disincentives for reform. Unfortunately, the benefits to the politicians are uncertain, right? You can conduct reforms, even really good ones, right? It's actually not that hard, and I'll talk about it a little bit in a minute. It's not hard to know what to do for anti-corruption reforms, but even if you do it, people might not notice, right? The population might not actually understand that you've done something good. You've alienated the small group that you're reforming without anybody else noticing that they've been reformed, and so you get very little benefit for it. Or people might notice, but you don't get much credit for it because it doesn't spill over into other things. They might say, hey, the police are better, but what's that got to do with Poroshenko, right? And we'll see that that's kind of what happens. Or maybe they'll say, yeah, sure, the police are better. Yeah, sure, the government did it. But that was last year, man. Like life has moved on. They forget. They become accustomed to the fact that this is a reformed institution that's no longer corrupt. And what have you done for me lately, right? The classic sort of politician's problem. So if this is all true, then is it worth it for the politician to actually engage in anti-corruption reforms, and how can we make it so? Moreover, the problem of corruption in particular, it's always a moving target, and this was in one of the other readings that I recommended for the class. The question of how to address corruption is not hard. What you need is transparency. So some of you have understood this very well, right? Transparency is my number one weapon. Sunshine. In the US, they call them sunshine laws. You shine a light on what's happening, and the cockroaches run away, right? This is the thing. So sunshine, transparency, openness, and engagement. Engagement with a broader public, not just engagement with the interests that are directly at stake, not just an engagement with the stakeholders, but engagement with broader societal interests. This is really, really critical to the whole process too. In other words, engagement with civil society. What's really wonderful about the reanimation package for reforms and about Ukrainian civil society more broadly, and I've written about this elsewhere, is that you have a kind of inbuilt jury who can evaluate how reform is going, right? And provide information to others, in particular to international donors, to the EU, who are providing assistance. You can really get the true story. They don't have to have their information filtered through the perspective of the government. They get plenty of that, but also having an independent civil society engaged and involved in all of these reforms allows you to kind of get independent information. But it remains the case that when you reform in one institution, corruption doesn't magically go away. What it does is it moves, right? So we were, in one of the articles I suggested people might want to read, this is an article about large-scale reform at the World Bank in tender processes and contracting processes that they run. So what the researchers did was they looked at tenders for contracts with the World Bank before and after the introduction of a reform that required more transparency, that required more public information about tenders. So simple transparency, openness, and engagement, simple stuff. And what they found was, lo and behold, the cost of the tenders go down. In other words, the corruption associated with tenders goes down, right? The reforms work, right? But then when they look at sectors that are not covered by the legislation, they get worse, right? More corruption's there. So the corruption just moves somewhere else. And so it's always this kind of perpetual game of trying to track, trying to follow, trying to think about the unintended consequences. And this is where civil society plays this really incredibly important role as watchdogs, as people who are able to, be sufficiently close to the issues and close to the people involved in the issues to see this kind of moving target nature. Which is why reforms require civil society, and reform requires civil society not just in the sense of, kind of let's consult. No, it requires institutionalized consultation. It requires a role, a seat, an institutionalized seat at the table for civil society activists. And that's often hard to do because of resistance from insiders. So those are some of the sort of key challenges that we need to kind of think through when we're thinking about incentive-compatible reforms. So why am I talking about patrol police reform in Ukraine? Why is that interesting beyond the subject of patrol police itself? And this is the subject of this paper that I've written with my colleague at Princeton, Grigory Popelikesh, with whom I've been doing surveys in Ukraine, I think, since, as I mentioned, since 2012. What's really interesting about this patrol police reform is that generally when people look at corruption and public perceptions of corruption and changes in corruption, they do these very aggregate studies. So they'll do a survey maybe across a bunch of different countries, and they'll ask people about how corrupt they think the society is or various institutions are, and then they'll look for correlates. So they'll look for things that vary along with that, right? And so you have this very kind of highly aggregated sense of what's going on, and it's very hard to actually have a detailed and grounded understanding of what's really driving corruption perceptions. With these big cross-national studies like the World Bank often runs, it's hard to know what's going on. What's really cool about the police reform in Ukraine in 2015, 2016 is that it allows us to basically come up with a kind of quasi-experimental design. The reforms are rolled out over time in different places. And so this allows, and they're not everywhere. And they're also done without a kind of detailed needs assessment. They're not done on the basis of the most corrupt place first, and then the less corrupt places. They're done more on a kind of where can we get this up and running? This is this is a revolutionary situation. We don't have time to do a deep analysis. Let's just roll it out, right? And so what we get is a sort of as if random allocation of reforms and over time. And so this allows us to do two things. One, it allows us to compare reformed places and unreformed places. And then the over time element allows us to look at who got the effect of older reforms versus the effect of more recent reforms. Right? So this allows us to look at, do people actually notice the reforms? Do politicians get credit for it? And how long does that last? Right? The three questions that I mentioned earlier. So the Ukrainian police reforms are actually super cool in that regard from a kind of social science methods perspective. So the police reform, it started in Khmelnytsky in 2015. And by the end of 2016, there were new patrol police in 32 cities and 3 oblasts, 3 largest cities in Ukraine, in government-held parts of Ukraine. The cities were pretty much all district capitals, all oblast capitals, which sort of introduces some bias into the allocation. Right? These are all big cities. We have to sort of recognize that. But there's no needs assessment done, as I mentioned, right? So it's not like the most corrupt cities got it first or anything like that. It gets rolled out just over time on a kind of administrative, more or less ad hoc basis. And if you look at, you can look using regression analysis, you can look carefully at what are the correlates of having a reform. Was it corruption perceptions before? We use these older surveys. Was it, is there some kind of demographic thing? Is it to do with income? Is it to do with education? None of those things predict the implementation of reforms except for city size, right? Oblast capitals. So we're pretty confident that what we have here is a really nicely quasi-random rollout of reforms that allows us to get real empirical leverage, real causal leverage over what these reforms actually do in terms of public perceptions and in terms of political credit. So as I said, we focus on corruption perceptions. There's really good evidence that corruption perceptions actually really matter. They matter for all sorts of political factors that we might care about. They matter for political engagement. They matter for voting. They matter for people's understanding of whether they can trust their politicians, right? So it's a really, really important factor. We also obviously care about actual outcomes, whether corruption goes down. That's much harder to measure, and you'll see that I just don't measure it in this. We kind of duck the issue. There's I can talk more about some other indicators that we have that suggest there is some real effect on corruption. But here, what we care about is perceptions, because perceptions is what matters politically, right? It's perceptions really that drive the politics of the situation. So we know that corruption perceptions matter, but we don't really know the answer to these other questions. Do politicians get credit, and how long does that credit last? There's some other research that suggests that politicians might get credit for anti-corruption reforms. There's a famous study by Olken from 2009 looking at road reforms in Indonesia, where citizens actually fairly accurately can tell if their roads were repaired, right? I mean, it's a fairly concrete example. So there's some research there. There's some research in Latin America that also suggests that citizens are pretty good at identifying which institutions are more corrupt and which ones are less corrupt. And there's some research that suggests that sort of citizen-level perceptions correlate pretty well with international level perceptions of corruption in different countries for what that's worth, but I'm not sure it's worth that much. So there is some research to suggest that corruption perceptions are related in some sense to effects. But again, most of these studies are cross-national and fairly aggregate. There are other people who say no, corruption perceptions are not in any way related to actual reforms. The corruption perceptions are actually driven by the media. There's a really nice paper from Basir Cheka from 2013. He's a former student of mine, actually, who shows that as corruption goes down, corruption perceptions often go up because there's more talk about it in the media. And so people think things are getting worse when actually things are getting better. Right? You see this often with economic data or with crime perceptions, where people's perceptions of what's going on are driven more by the conversation than the reality on the ground. And then there's other studies that show things like religion matter, democracy matters, levels of development matter for this relationship. In other words, lots of big macro stuff that's really got nothing to do with actual corruption. So this is the sort of conversation that our research is engaging in. So what's the data that we're using? Well, we have a two-wave nationally representative sample. This is after 2014, so it doesn't include Crimea or parts of the Donbass. The first survey was of about 1,800 respondents in 2015, and then we went back and re-interviewed the same individuals face-to-face in 2016. Working with Razumkov, with Mikhailo Mishenka, we got an extraordinarily high re-interview rate. We got 74%, which, if you've ever seen these kinds of panel studies, that's really great. And what's cool about a panel study is that, I don't know how many of you are interested in social science research methods, but I think one thing you can do with a panel study, with interviewing the same people over time, is you can actually identify causation. Right? You can identify a change that in the world that actually, and follow its actual effects, right? Because you're speaking to the same people, you're controlling for all of the different characteristics of these individuals over time, right? Which is not something you can normally do with two different samples, right? It's very hard to do with two different samples. So this is a very cool data setup, very unusual. We had nearly 1,300 respondents in the second round, and then we weight the results for what's called attrition. Some people drop out, right? And it's not random who drops out. It's often related to age, it's often related to employment status. So we were going around and knocking on people's doors and asking them questions. And if you happen to be home both times, then maybe you don't have a job that takes you out of the home, right? So you get this kind of differential attrition. We don't have a huge problem with because we get such a high re-interview rate because we have such great Ukrainian interviewers, but we weight the results to take into account the different kinds of demographic attrition that you could get. And so we did interviews in 107 localities around Ukraine. In 29 of them, there are new police set up during the course of our study, between Survey 1 and Survey 2. Roughly 40% of our respondents, because it's big cities, it's only 29 of 107 localities, but it's most of our people. And we divide the reforms up into two periods: reforms that took place in 2015, and then reforms that took place in 2016 before our second round. Our second round was in June of 2016. We do something called a difference in difference design. In other words, what we do is we look at people's corruption perceptions in period 1, we look at corruption perceptions in period 2, we look at the change, and then we see how that's related to whether they had a reform or not. Right? It's a very sort of classical, kind of gold standard way to conduct this kind of research. And we control for a bunch of other things that could be confounding the results, such as people's language, region, age, education, those kinds of things. So that's the setup. And what I'm going to do now is take you through some of the results, some of the things that we found. We're going to have some graphs, and I'll explain how to interpret the graphs when we get to them. So we asked a couple of questions that are central to this study. The first is we asked people how widespread they think corruption is among certain institutions. The police, local officials, the presidential administration, and the parliament. We think that none of these people are corrupt, that some of them are corrupt, that most of them are corrupt, or all of them. Right? That's our main kind of outcome indicator. And then we asked them some things that we think might matter. So we asked them how much they like or dislike President Poroshenko. This was during the Poroshenko administration on a 0 to 4, so a 5-point scale. How much do they like his party, the Petro Poroshenko bloc, right? So we're trying to identify who are partisans and who are not. And then we ask whether people think Poroshenko is the legitimate president of Ukraine. This is kind of a question that comes from the revolutionary context of 2013, 2014. So the way you're going to understand these charts, I'm going to show you a whole bunch of them, so let's get down with it before we start. We're going to have the perceived change on the bottom, right? So this is our 4-point scale, so if you change by 6 points, that's by 6/10, that's a lot, right? That's a huge change. And we're going to have each of the institutions on the y-axis. These dots are our estimated point value for the change, and then these tails are the 95% confidence interval. So we're 95% sure that the answer lies somewhere along these bars, right? That's the sort of basic setup for all of these charts. So in terms of corruption perceptions, what we find is that people notice, right? People notice in the reformed towns, these are the difference between reformed towns and not reformed towns. The change in the perception of corruption of the police is negative, so people think the police are less corrupt, right, than they were before, by almost half a point, right, which is on our little 1 to 0 to 4 scale is a lot, right. So it has a really significant effect on a really substantial and statistically significant effect on people's corruption perceptions. Right? We also find that, yeah, there is political credit to be got from this. Right? The only difference between these respondents is some of them live in towns that have reformed police and some of them don't. And they think the ones in reformed towns think that the presidency, the presidential administration, is less corrupt than the ones in the other towns. Right? So Poroshenko's administration gets credit, and it's not massive. It's 0.2 of a point on our little scale, which is about a standard deviation. It's quite a bit, and it's probably as big as any other individual factor, right? So this, to the extent that you can move people's perceptions of corruption, this is pretty powerful stuff. The parliament that passes the reform gets some credit too, roughly the same as the president. So there's plenty of political benefit to go around. So this is from a political perspective, this kind of reform that's highly visible is pretty cool, right? And interestingly enough, the local governments get less credit for it, and it's smaller and statistically maybe 0. We're not sure. It's kind of it's small and there's a larger potential error around it, right? In other words, people really associate this reform with the central government. This is local police being reformed, which is interesting, but they think of this as being a reform driven by the central government, which it was, right? This was not, the local administrations were hardly even consulted about this, actually. It was very much driven from Kyiv. And so this is good news, right? Politicians do a good thing, they get credit for it. This is what we want. This is incentive compatible. Unfortunately, people are people, right? And so when you look at the patterns over time, the good news starts to kind of fade off a little bit. So the reforms that happened in 2015 versus the reforms that happened in 2016. So when we were asking in the summer, late summer of 2016, how you feel about corruption of the police, the presidency, and the parliament, what you find is that towns where they had the most recent reforms have bigger effects, and where they have the older reforms, the effects are starting to disappear towards 0. Even for the police, people still notice the police as that's probably still, we have fairly confident that there's still an effect, although it's starting to drift towards 0. The presidency in the older reforms, just the year before, it's already basically gone, right? And for the parliament, it's basically gone. So the politicians get like a 6-month benefit. Lots of stuff happens, right? Politics is, events. Right? So there's credit, but it's short-lived. And then in terms of the broader political effects, they're really fairly limited, right? So the evaluation of Poroshenko's party doesn't change, right? So the credit doesn't spread really broadly to his party in general, and then his own evaluation doesn't change very much, nor does People don't understand what this question's about. You can see these massive error bars around it. They're like, huh, what? So the political effects seem pretty narrow. So there's an effect on the institution, the police. There's an effect on people's understanding of corruption, but their political support doesn't move very much, or if at all, right? So I recognize you did a good thing. I recognize maybe you're not as corrupt as I thought you were. Still not going to vote for you. This is politically important, right? If you look at trust in the police goes up by a fair amount, pretty significantly. Trust in the president doesn't change at all. Trust in the parliament barely moves. Right? So the windfall around these reforms, it's not spilling over out of corruption into other fields. And then if you break it down, the respondents down by partisanship, by whether they are either support the opposition or they don't support anybody or they support Poroshenko's government, what you find is the effects are, for the police, both, almost everybody sees the effect on the police. Even opposition people mostly see an effect. They mostly think the police are less corrupt. The effect on perceptions of corruption in the presidency is focused around government supporters. Right? In other words, the people who are already supporting you think you've done a good thing, and the people who don't already support you are like, maybe. And ditto with the parliament. Again, it's government partisans that think the parliament's done something good. What about news? What about people's focus on, is this just kind of made up, or is there actually some basis to this? And what we find is that people who watch TV news daily are more aware of the reforms, and they respond more to them. So they have sort of the same size of effect for police reform, but for the presidency, the effect is larger, and certainly for the parliament, and it's only statistically significant amongst people who watch the news. So what you're really getting is your own supporters and political junkies. Right? In other words, not really broad social, highly consequential political changes. So this is our patrol policeman down in central Kyiv a couple of days ago. I was delighted to find this, and there's another one next to it with a nice dog. And a light, when you can get the police there, it's very exciting for me, having worked on this for a while. What we see is we get clear and durable effects of perceptions of corruption amongst the police. Right? So the police is the institution that really wins out of this whole process. People notice, they actually do. And so one thing to take away from this is, wow, this was cool, this was worth doing, right? At least in terms of public perceptions. Because this institution that was notoriously, I don't need to tell you guys, notoriously corrupt, right? All of a sudden has a rather different image, and people people interact with patrol police. They interact with traffic cops. They interact with cops on the street. This is really a thing. And there is some credit for the president. This is sort of a worthwhile thing to do. There is some credit for politicians, but it's short-lived, and the credit doesn't spill over very much, right? So even things that are pretty good and that people notice, from a politician's perspective, are uncertain in terms of the benefits. And so the challenge for anti-corruption advocates is to try and work out how to change that. Try and work out how to devise the reforms in such a way that they are more transparent, they are more public, and there is more benefit, more gain for politicians to get from it. So what we know from all of this, and I'll just wind up and we'll get to questions and conversation, is that big forces really matter in changing societies, but the small details really matter too. Right? And so it's a constant daily struggle. Getting things right is going to require daily hard work. Politicians don't like that. They're not good at it. They don't have the attention span for it. They don't have the incentives to do it. And so what civil society needs to do and what voters need to do is find a way to keep the pressure on constantly, find a way to keep these issues in the news, right? Public coverage, we found public coverage makes a big difference. We need to keep holding politicians' feet to the fire at elections. We need to make sure these issues are front and center. We need to make sure the information about what people have actually done and what the actual effects are is front and center. And this takes us all the way back to what I mentioned a little while ago about the role of civil society. Transparency and openness are really, really important, but organization and information, mobilizing that transparency, mobilizing that openness is really going to be the key to closing the reform circle. That's true in Ukraine, it's true pretty much everywhere. So thank you for listening. I talked for a long time. I look forward to questions, comments, criticisms. Yeah. It's like, but it looks good though, you know.
Anyway, it doesn't seem to me that I've seen many researches from a Western viewpoint with regard to reforms, especially in Ukraine, and how they. Oh yes.
There you go.
Good.
Whoa. Now I'm scared of you.
Okay. So, what I wanted to ask you is. You mentioned those factors that influence corruption perception, like reforms and some democratic factors too. What is the role of cultural institutions in corruption perception as far as you're concerned? Because I suppose there might be some correlation too. Like, for instance, there are countries, in corruption perception index, countries that are very isolated, like Bhutan, let's say, that are very, very high up in the rankings. They have very low corruption perception index, despite the fact that those countries aren't quite rich, they aren't quite developed, and yet people think that their country is not corrupt, or at least it's not heavily corrupt. And Ukraine could be comparable to those countries in terms of economic development, let's say, but here in Ukraine the situation is far worse. So maybe there is some role of culture in here, and maybe, I don't know, when I say culture, I mean there are many ways to look at it. For instance, you could say that you could look at the so-called culture of guilt, culture of shame, culture of fear division, or there are some other frameworks to look at it. So, I mean, as far as you're concerned, is there some correlation here, or is it negligible? Yeah, thanks.
Great, thank you. That's a really, really good question, and it's something people talk about a lot in terms of expectations in societies, and it's one of the things that I was talking about at the beginning, and that changing expectations and changing understandings of what's, you know, quote unquote normal is really it's central to anti-corruption campaigns. And so there's sort of two ways to think about the relationship between culture and corruption. One is the relationship between, you know, a culture of the acceptance of corruption, the acceptance of, you know, private payments outside of the system in order for service. And then there's the relationship between culture and perceptions, right? And the degree to which people see and criticize corruption. The easier one to handle for social scientists, I think, is the perceptions question, right? And we see that that there's a sort of paradoxical effect of openness and democracy in that perceptions dimension. I alluded to that when talking about Basir Cheka earlier on, but it is true that there's a relationship between political competition and corruption perceptions, and it's a negative relationship. And it's not actually because more competitive places are more corrupt. The opposite. It's because corruption is held up in the light and discussed, and so people think it's worse, right? You see this with democracy perceptions. This is always like crack me up if you look at cross-national surveys and you ask people, how successful is democracy in your country? And what's the country with the highest appreciation of their democracy in the world? Azerbaijan, obviously, because it's the best democracy. There's actually a negative correlation between democracy and perceptions of democracy. And corruption has the same kind of flavor to it, right? Which is why it's really important to do the kind of detailed work that I presented this morning, I think, because then you get to actually, okay, so those broader effects of misperceptions are one thing, but let's get down into the weeds and see, does reform actually matter, right? And so that's one thing. The other bigger question goes back to the kind of, people get the society they deserve, the kind of Joseph de Maistre view of the world. I always push back against that. Like, I always think that, no, in fact, there's quite a lot of evidence that people get told that for a reason, right? That corruption, that means corruption then becomes not the problem and the fault of the people who are corrupt and making money out of this, but of the citizenry at large, right? It's your fault that I'm corrupt. Like, really? That's what we're going to do, right? And so I think that's a useful political trope, right? And maybe you can find a correlation in there too, right? But I think it's missing the point. I think the point is that better institutions change people's perceptions, right? And so shaping people's idea of what's possible is really about changing the institutions and improving the situation. And then people's perceptions will follow. I mean, that's really one of the conclusions of our research, that when you actually improve the patrol police, you actually get people thinking it's better, right? So that's a sort of like first line finding that we have. And so I think it's really, really important not to get tricked by this idea that somehow Ukrainians are corrupt and so whatever, right? That's just the wrong way to think about it.
Thanks, and I just wanted to add this one little question. You mentioned those variables that you tested for in your research, and you mentioned regional dummies. What those were in your research?
So we used a fairly simple east, west, center, and south dummy just to kind of capture, sucks up variation across, sort of. We also control for language and ethnicity, but there's also kind of other regional factors that are harder to measure directly, and so that's what we do.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, yeah, sorry. I'm going to make the microphone do the maximum distance between all the way across the room and back.
Okay, thank you.
Hi.
So my question is the following. So we often get told that we have very high level of corruption and that we need to fight it in order to join the EU. And NATO is a bit different set of rules we need to comply with, but it's also to do with corruption as well. And I know for a fact that in lots of countries that are traditionally defined as West, so like the US, the UK, and I guess like France and Germany, they have some thing which is called lobbying, where like there are people paying money to some political parties to essentially represent their economical or personal interests in government. And so what would be an advice for Ukraine to fight its corruption by means of, making someone's interests not to collide with the interests of the state, and actually not to harm them, and do as well in lobbying, where it's kind of legalized, but so that it's actually kind of useful for the economy, kind of healthy, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is a great question. I always think of the U.S. does really well on corruption indices. And that's because corruption's legal, basically. The political system is extremely corrupt. It's bought out by private financial interests, but it's legal. It's called lobbying, right, as you say, or it's called party financing. And I live in the state of North Carolina, and the state of North Carolina was run by the Democrats since Reconstruction, so since 1895, right? And in 2012, the Republicans took control of the state for the first time in, 120 years, right? So what did they do? What was the first thing that they did? First thing they did was make it illegal for cities to provide free Wi-Fi. Right. And you're like, what? Like, that's what we've been waiting 120 years for you guys? That's what you guys came up with? Why? Because the cable company we basically owned donated enormous amounts of money to the Republican Party and was facing free competition for Wi-Fi from municipalities. And so, they made it illegal for the cities to provide free Wi-Fi for their citizens, so that they would have to buy their Wi-Fi from Time Warner Cable, right? And that was perfectly legal, perfectly above board. The other thing they did was make it legal to take handguns into a bar, which, I don't know who was paying off for that, but crazy madness, right? So the legalization of political influence like that is incredibly corrosive. And so one of the most important corruption forms, we can talk about police all day long, right? We can talk about low-level bureaucrats all day long. These issues are actually pretty tractable, and they're relatively easy to do something about, because the interests that are at stake are not the big interests, they're not the huge moneyed interests. The really hard thing is to take money out of big politics, out of national politics. And that involves campaign finance laws. It involves laws around equal access to media. It involves taking media oligarchs out of the conversation. It involves the development of public interest broadcasting and equal time for different political perspectives. These are all really, really, really fundamental reforms that don't sound like they're anti-corruption, but they're at the core of a healthy, competitive, open political system. And so, it's really, it's one thing for me to sit here and talk about patrol police. It's at least as important to talk about party financing and the financing of national politics. So you're absolutely correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your lecture. I actually got a bunch of questions, but I'll probably connect them all in one. So I don't want to sound a little bit too pessimistic about this, but we have taken a close look at one institution, the police. Now we have a very hard to tackle problem, is that when you come to Ukraine and people say, oh, Ukraine is corrupt, the first thing, the image that probably comes to your mind is the government officials are corrupt.
Right.
And here is the issue. Government officials are everywhere. It's not only the police, and especially is the judiciary branch, which should be like the one that enacts, the one that implements, the one that shows how to do it. And the problem is that for many years, we also had this very huge scandal with the head of the one of the judiciary institutions, a huge one. It was absolutely insane how the person having such a position still opted for a corruption scheme at that position, like I said. My point here is that despite how many institutions we create, despite how many, you already mentioned National Anti-Corruption Bureau, and also have this State Bureau for Investigation, on all those institutions, they don't have this level of trust. And I'm pretty sure that the miracle that happened with the police, and indeed it was some kind of miracle that people actually felt the results, that the reforms are actually strong in this regard, it's not actually happening. We've been trying to tackle this for a very long time. Like I said, probably the issue is that government officials are everywhere, so you can't really tackle only one institution and say, oh, government officials of, for example, National Anti-Corrupt Bureau are absolutely not corrupt. Because people here believe that people are already corrupt. Like I said, here is me, and there are 13 of the most corrupt people in Ukraine. So my question, it boils down to one question: how to tackle this corruption of in government officials, first of all, and second of all, are there any good viable methods of measuring corruption not based on social opinions, so to say? Because perception, how we learned, is in social sciences is a very hard subject. It changes itself, so to say. When you say something to public receives it and then analyzes itself, and it's the ping pong kind of process. So is there any kind of viable method of measuring data, maybe according to levels of corruption, which are real ones? For example, in readings that you offered for this kind of class, they measured this kind of effect of, how was it called? The displacement effect.
Right.
When, yes, the reform worked, but for example, it didn't work because, and they have data to certify that, yeah, it didn't work because of numbers. Maybe there is another way to measure it, because in Ukraine, the public opinion is a very bad problem. Thank you.
Sure. No, these are really great and very hard questions. I mean, one of the problems is exactly as you say, that there are so many government officials. They are everywhere, and when you're, by necessity, reform is going to be piecemeal, right? You can't do one reform that happens everywhere. One of the lessons, I think, from Ukraine and from myriad other countries is that that you're never done, right? That you have to establish monitoring and evaluation of institutions, and you have to keep doing it, and you have to spread the scope all the time, and you have to, progress is incremental and slower than people want it to be. But I think it's really important to understand how much progress Ukraine has made. I know people get tired. I know people get, sick that there's not been a miracle and it's not a kind of a brand new day. But it's very, 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 very different. Ukraine has made enormous strides in cleaning up big politics. Big politics are not clean, but they're much cleaner in cleaning up officials. And so if you look at, there was a system for evaluating parliamentary candidates that started to be created actually by the former chief of staff of Yushchenko. Became disillusioned with Yushchenko turning basically a blind eye to a lot of corruption after he won the presidential office. Started NGOs that were engaged around, kind of cleaning the parliament up. This understanding that you had to shine as much light on the individuals who are running for parliamentary offices, shine as much light on the individuals who are candidates for appointed positions within local administrations, within regional administrations, within the national government. The more transparency, the more evaluation, the more you open the books on who these people are and what the process is, the better the incentives for getting people who are actually clean and people who, changing their behavior. That's all had a big difference, had a big effect on the kinds of people that are sitting in the parliament in Ukraine now, relative to those who were sitting in the parliament even in 2014. That's indisputable, I think. Unfortunately, with the full-scale war, it's hard to know how that's going to evolve in terms of. But each Ukrainian election has been better than the previous one, right? So 2019 was a better election than 2014 in terms of who got elected to the parliament, in terms of anti-corruption and whatnot. So there is progress. It is slow, but it's really all about transparency, and that feeds into sort of questions about measures, indicators. So there are good ways of measuring the extent to which, for example, public money is kind of diverted in the public procurement system. You can see, you can look at premiums, what people are paying for different kinds of projects. You can collect data across. The great thing about having a big country like Ukraine is you can collect data across different regions, and you can contrast what it costs to build a bridge in different parts of the country, and then work out from there, okay, how much is getting skimmed off in different parts of the country, and then focus your efforts on those kinds of regions. So anytime there's public money involved, the more transparency you have about what individual contracts actually cost, that creates a tool for anti-corruption campaigners that's really pretty reliable. It's actually pretty good, and gets you into the nitty-gritty. Where things are not measured, where things don't have quantities put on them, then that's where it becomes murky, right? And becomes really, really difficult. So the more there's a focus on collecting statistics, putting all those statistics, Ukraine has been a world leader in digitalization of government information. That's huge. Ukraine also happens to have lots of brilliant young people who are really good at taking all that data and analyzing it and working with it, and that's another incredible strength in this country. And those are, again, like really good tools for policing and for engaging civil society with those kinds of reforms. So it's always the same, like as I said earlier on, it's kind of not hard to know what to do. It's about getting it done, right? That's the challenge. Yeah. Yeah.
So thanks for the great lecture. I have two questions, if I may. The first one is directly related to your research. I was wondering if you've done something similar in other countries, or let's say if you were evaluating other reforms. I'm particularly curious about this notion that with time the effect of the reform fades. My question here is that, let's say, it's quite known that in Ukraine over the past 8-9 years we had a lot of reforms that were rolled out very ambitiously, like we will, let's say, fire old staff, we will fire everyone, we will hire everyone new, and no corrupt, everyone is professional. But with the time, let's say the authority comes to the realization that they cannot do this, so they still have to keep half of the corrupt old staff, and
right.
So my question is, maybe like this reform was in fact not very successful. That's why the perception of the public was worse after a year. So that's the first question.
Mm-hmm. So I haven't got this kind of rigorous detail of data for other reforms in other countries or for other areas, other reform areas in Ukraine. This kind of opportunity arises just, it was serendipitous out of the data collection that we were doing. But I have studied reform in Georgia reasonably closely in similar kinds of reforms, and I can tell you the Ukrainian ones are much more successful than what happened in Georgia, where they really did clear out much more dramatically the personnel, but they didn't change the institutions. They didn't change the dependence upon the politicians for the Interior Ministry and the police and anything like the thoroughgoing way that it did in Ukraine. And so the Ukrainian reforms have been much more successful than the reforms on which they were partly based, actually. The reforms here in Ukraine were led by Georgians, right? So ironically, the Georgians did a better job in Ukraine than they did in Georgia, right? So it wasn't the Georgians, but the trick though is to do more of these kinds of studies, right? To do more of this kind of data collection and to do more at the design stage of reforms. So one of the problems with public policy in general, but with reforms specifically, is that when they're implemented, usually what happens is we go ahead and we do a policy. And then afterwards we're like, did it work or did it not? Oh, I don't know, let's go see. And then you can't actually see because you didn't build evaluation into the project from the very beginning, right? If you really want to know if something worked, then you have to develop a baseline. So exactly the kind of thing that didn't happen with these police reforms, there was no needs assessment done at the beginning. So there was no sense of how corrupt the cops were in different towns and then how corrupt they ended up, right? This is why, in part, why we're using public opinion data rather data, some other kind of data, because there was no data collection involved, built into the reform design. If you really want to know if your reforms are working, what you need to do is you need to think about, okay, we're going to introduce these reforms in such a way that we can measure them. We're going to decide what our metrics are. We're going to measure them before we start, and we're going to measure them at the end. And we're going to introduce the reforms in different places as randomly, if appropriate, you can do random allocation of reforms. So, for example, school reforms, new curricula. You can introduce the new curriculum in some schools and not in others. Try and randomize that. Then after a year, you can evaluate whether they really work. And if they work, then you spread them everywhere, just like we do with medicines, right? You do a randomized controlled trial first before you start giving this medicine to the whole population. You can do that with reforms. Not all reforms, but many kinds of reforms. And so thinking creatively and at minimum having a baseline for the key metrics that you're interested in before you start. But also thinking about implementation and how that will help you evaluate later. And that's a process that really isn't done. It's not done very well. It's starting to be done at some of the international donors. It's, a little bit. I've worked on projects in Ukraine and in eastern Ukraine with USAID, with the American government in the past, helping them to evaluate reforms. And they have no idea because they didn't design the reforms to be evaluated, the projects to be evaluable, right? That's really critical, actually, and that's where social scientists can actually be really important in the process because we understand what it means to do an evaluation. We understand the kind of data that you're going to have to collect. We understand the kind of implementation that you're going to need to do in order to identify the effect that you're looking for. Now, you can't do it perfectly. It's public policy. There are all sorts of pressures. But having that design, having that evaluation in the design phase of the reforms themselves is crucial.
Thanks. And my second question, actually, Google, that this year Ukraine was removed from, Council of Europe removed Ukraine from a blacklist of countries that prevent combating corruption, which I think it's a good sign. So my second question is related to anti-corruption. Regardless of that, we know that it's an issue, so corruption and fighting corruption, it's very important. Those cases are being covered in media and brought to court and everything, so we know that. On the other hand, situation in Ukraine, because of the full-scale invasion, it's very vulnerable, and we rely very much on the assistance from the outside, like financial aid, etc. So as a Ukrainian, I often wonder, and maybe you have some thoughts on that, so how to balance it? So on one hand, as a Ukrainian, I would want that anti-corruption activities to continue, even if it's Ministry of Defense or Army or whatever, so I want this to continue. On the other hand, I don't want international donors to say, look, we sent all those billions to Ukraine, right, and then they just, nothing changes, they just steal those money, so how about we stop sending the aid? And basically it would be very unfortunate situation for Ukraine. So maybe you have some thoughts on how to balance this or whatever. That's my second question.
So I come here with a lot of humility and modesty about what I found and what I can show you about data and results. Giving Ukraine advice about how to manage the situation is something that I would do with tremendous care because it's you guys are in this situation and you're handling it amazingly. My experience of this is when the full-scale invasion happened, I sat down with my colleagues. I run the Center for Slavic Eurasian and East European Studies at UNC, so the part of the university that's focused on this region and specifically for me, Ukraine, because that's where I've done work. And the thought was, what could we do? How can we bring the skills and knowledge and resources that we have to help Ukraine? And there was two things that we wanted to do. One was to what we called amplify Ukrainian voices, and that was to bring as many Ukrainians to speak to people in the United States as we possibly could, so that Americans could hear from Ukrainians about their situation. So not from me, not from Americans, or I'm actually Scottish, but right, not from foreigners who have opinions about Ukraine, but from Ukrainians, right? And so I always privilege the Ukrainian perspective first. And then the second was to basically speak to everyone who I could persuade to listen about Ukraine. And so I've traveled. North Carolina is about 6 hours drive from one side to the other, in the mountains on the one side and the beach on the coast on the other. And I've given talks all across the state about Ukraine and about the situation and about what Americans need to do to help Ukraine and to be part of the solution, and to try and explain to Americans that the crisis that Ukraine is fighting, they're fighting for them. And so that's why they have to support Ukraine. This is not just Ukraine's fight. This is fight for democracy and civilization. And Americans have to be on board with that. So that all said, I faced this question about corruption many, many times when I go to audiences. And I think there's two things to say about it that I can say about it anyway. One is that it's really important to demonstrate that Ukraine is serious about anti-corruption, and so the kinds of stories that we've seen in the news recently, right, from the Ministry of Defense and elsewhere, I actually think that the net effect is positive. I think by showing that Ukraine, even under these extraordinary conditions, even under this terrible situation, is still serious about anti-corruption, I think that rebounds well to Ukraine's credit with serious people in Washington. You know, there are unserious people in Washington who are Russian stooges, basically, right? And it doesn't matter. You're not going to change their minds. They're going to campaign for what they're going to campaign for. But serious people, and some of them are Republicans. Like my own two senators in North Carolina are both Republicans. They're both big supporters of Ukraine. And we've spoken with them about this and their staffs, and they understand what's at stake here. And I think continuing to take anti-corruption seriously is part of that process, showing the world that Ukraine continues to stand for democracy and civilization, even under this enormous pressure. I think it's really useful and valuable. I know that's not an answer, but that's my thoughts on that.
No, thanks. I was just curious. Yeah.
We can clearly see in worldwide politics the problem of the power transition, and in Ukraine, new governments, new elected politicians always tend to prosecute previous governments to get them off with something. And in Ukraine, we can clearly see that example too. In each presidency, after each revolution, we can see these examples. On the contrary, in many Western countries, this works like different. Many monarchies, many authorities after revolutions could live long and die peacefully. And my question is, do you see the problem of power transition as one of the corruption Ukrainian institutional problem, and how big is that? Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is really interesting. So I think the basic problem that you point to is real, right? And the problem is essentially one in which you consider your predecessor to be somehow illegitimate. Right? This is why we had do you think Poroshenko is a legitimate president, right? Because he comes to the presidency after a revolution, right? So do you consider that the process somehow is kind of not legitimate? And we've had with Ukraine's 3 revolutions, right? 2 in the democratic era. There is this sort of demonization of the previous regime that takes place, and that's seen as a kind of a relatively normal part of politics, or at least a profitable style of politics. And I don't know. I mean, it's so hard to tell because of the intervention of the full-scale invasion. But I saw, and this comes from a Ukrainian friend of mine, Olga Onuch, who's got a really nice book called The Zelensky Effect. That sort of outlines some of this, but the political strategy of the Zelensky presidency, both in the election of 2019, in the presidential election and in the parliamentary elections, was different from the previous strategies. The previous strategies from Poroshenko, and basically everyone that ran before was sort of focused around identity and demonization, right? Focused around like real Ukrainians versus somehow not real Ukrainians, focused around the kind of different mobilizing identities. And that's why you get this map, this political map, in which, in every election, one half of the country votes for one candidate and the other half of the country votes overwhelmingly for the other candidate, right? And what Zelensky did was to change that map, and you can just see it. I don't have the slides with me, but I often show these visuals where you just see where the vote comes from across a much broader range of the country. And I think was a first step towards the normalization of political competition within the country, and a move away from the claim that somehow your opponents are illegitimate, and to a more normal kind of politics. Now, if you're running against Yanukovych, I mean, you're not wrong to demonize him, right? I mean, it's accurate, right? So maybe the election of President Zelensky was the beginning of a new political era in Ukraine, when that Poroshenko still got accused of corruption and tried. So maybe not, right? But over time, the kind of normalization of politics, you would hope to see those things kind of change. And I think Ukraine was on the beginnings of that path, but of course, what's going to happen now is much more uncertain. But you're absolutely right. Transition is everything, and if you don't think there's a life for you after politics, then you're gonna steal more and more and more, right? That's for sure.
And one little question more. I really love your presentation. I love the sources. Could we have this presentation after your lecture?
Absolutely, yeah, of course.
Thanks.
Yeah. There's a question over there first.
Okay, I have a few questions. The first one about institutional capability in deep state. Is it right to, or how to measure stability, resilience, and sustainability of state institutions if someone, for example, Trump, wants to take it over and to use it in his own aims? So maybe it is okay to stay the USA have right, or maybe stable democracy, but maybe Trump didn't have enough supporters of his movement, or didn't have enough time, and if he comes back the next year, he will succeed. And it's on the one side, and on the other side, on the other hand, we can see an example of Orban. Hungary has free or almost free elections, but he has a lot of supporters, and maybe it's like a real threat to democracy. So the question is, free democracy or what is a sign of stable democracy, or how to measure it?
Yeah, so this is a classic question, right? Like, what's a stable democracy? And I remember, back in the early 1990s, this was like one of the big questions that people talked about in political science was, when have you consolidated the transition? And there was a number of measures, and it was like, okay, Adam Jaworski had what they called the two turnover test. If power has changed hands twice, that means you're a democracy and you're a stable democracy. Well, Japan, power never changed hands over 50 years, and yet somehow it was still a democracy. And then sort of like Larry Diamond and his collaborators and Linson Steppen, they were talking about, well, really it's about public opinion, and when when more than 70% of the population thinks democracy is the best way to govern, then that's kind of that's how democracy is entrenched, right? And you think about the US, they've had hundreds of transitions, dozens of transitions, way more than 70%, and then all of a sudden we're in pretty deep trouble, right? Same with with Hungary. And I think what this points to is that democracy is contingent. It's a daily experience, and what happened in the post-Cold War, in the post-Second World War era, and then even more in the post-Cold War era, is there was complacency set in because for 2 generations, democracy had seemed pretty stable in these countries, right? And there was a lack of attention to threats from outside. And I think part of this is we can discuss why democracy is in crisis around the world, whether it's to do with social media or whether it's to do with economic changes from the Great Recession or what it is. And I think there's an interesting conversation to be had about that. But what we learned was that democracy is much less stable than we thought, and that authoritarians are much more sophisticated, right? Not all authoritarians, some, but not all authoritarians wear jackboots and black jackets and march up and down, right? That authoritarians are much more equipped to infiltrate political institutions, legal institutions, media institutions than we thought. So that all of which is to say, I don't think there is a kind of magical measure that tells you, country X, Y, and Z, these are stable democracies, these ones are not, right? I think there are, that it's a constant battle. I think the battle is much more intense now than it's been in a long time. And I think there are enormous interdependencies between countries. So it's not really something that you would measure at the country level. You wouldn't measure, the Netherlands and say, look, the Netherlands is a stable democracy and Belgium's not, right? The stability of democracy in the Netherlands depends upon the stability of democracy in Belgium and France and Germany. Which is why, as I said earlier on in answer to another question, Ukraine's fight against authoritarianism and repression from Russia is America's fight. It is Britain's fight. It is France's fight. It is Germany's fight. Democracy dies in Ukraine, then democracy is weaker everywhere, and authoritarianism is stronger everywhere. And the sooner that people in the so-called West understand that, the better and the more important it is. So I really think we have this interdependent relationship that's not reducible to some kind of individual measure.
So you mean like a quantity of free elections of electoral cycles?
So that was how people measured it in the 90s, yeah. That was the idea was, okay, the more free elections you had, the more stable you would become, right? The more democracy would become, what the term that they used was consolidated, right?
But we have an example of Ukraine when the war started. Of course, we could have like a crash of our institutions, but they were strong. Of course, I don't adore like our structure of our power when everyone is dependent on our office of Zelensky, but it worked, and maybe it's like a structure of maybe kind of movement towards authoritarianism, but maybe it could work in difficult times. So maybe it's like a treatment to Russian past, but maybe it's our own past to struggle with Russia.
Mm-hmm.
And the second question about how should anti-corruption work, upside down or from down to top? Like, should society form this narrative or the state policy, or maybe some people from society who can reach out cabinets of power and to talk with people and to explain them how corruption works and how we should fight with it and in what way, or maybe it should be like conversation within our society to persuade our officials not to take bribes or give bribes and so on.
So left to its own devices, the state is going to be corrupt. That's true everywhere, right? I mean, the only way that you eliminate corruption is through transparency, sunlight, social engagement. If people are not if civil society is not interested in this topic, if people are not campaigning around this topic, then corruption gets worse. That's true in every country that's ever been, I think, right? I think the key here is that it has to be a bottom-up process. You have, but as the whole kind of premise of the research that I talked about was that you have to incentivize the leadership, right? The leadership is going to be there. You have to create the social incentives. You have to create the political incentives for the state to be interested in anti-corruption. Otherwise, it won't be. So, yeah. Come to you.
Yep, thanks. I want to come back to your research, and during, I'm sorry. And during their representation, I have a thought that people always like hyped up when new reform and anti-corruption reform as well introduced. For example, I remember the time of patrol police reform, and people like went crazy because it was really what people wanted, because action of militia during the Revolution of Dignity, and me being a kid on the street, like being harassed on like basic, it was like a routine. So that reform was really embraced by public, but it also connected with the whole police reformation. So we talk about not only the reform of patrol police, but the whole system of police. And it kind of wasn't introduced in a way that people wanted. Right. And I believe when you presented your surveys, one of the surveys was at the beginning of the when the new patrol police were introduced. And so everybody like have a nice perception of it, and it was good, and people said, okay, yeah, it's nice, we love it, we want something like that. But after like a year and more, we started to tackling the problem of how we can't replace investigators, how investigators that were fired from their jobs, they went to court and tried to reinstitute them, etc., etc. So, of course, perception of people, it would be distorted by that, and they will say, okay, I don't like that reform anymore. Mm-hmm. So my question was about actually methodology. So can we isolate these effects when we're trying to measure that perception of reform? But when we talk about something great, I believe when anti-corruption institutions that introduced in Ukraine, we also can say that, okay, when NABU was created, or anti-corruption court was created, everybody was, yeah, it's great, our partners want that, Ukrainians want that, but when we don't see like immediate results, hypes is dropping, and encouragement as well, and we were starting, oh, it's not done as we wanted it to be done. So yeah. When we're doing such researches, can we kind of introduce some instruments that can isolate it and to perceive it in a more like pure way? Mm-hmm. Thanks.
So the methodological question with research is, there's a good answer to that one. The broader question about reform fatigue, I don't have a good answer to that question, but so in terms of the research, well, we had two waves of surveys. We had one before any of the police reforms were introduced, and then we had one in late 2016. And so what we compare when we look at the reforms in different places is we see that the places that had reforms in 2015, the positive effects of those are already wearing off by the end of 2016. The places that had the later reforms that took place in 2016, you get a bigger effect when we measure it at the end of or in fall of 2016. So what that suggests is that the later reforms have a bigger effect than the earlier reforms. When in actual fact, as you point out, the earlier reforms were more thoroughgoing than the later reforms. And if you just look at the number of policemen replaced, it's more in the earlier reforms than in the later reforms, like pretty dramatically, actually. And so what we see in the data is confirmation that it's the recency of the reforms rather than the quality of the reforms that has the big effect. So just like you say, right? So people are excited about it, even more excited about the reforms that are not quite as good as the earlier ones, because they've kind of forgotten about the earlier ones. So that sort of political attention span, that's what we're capturing. Definitely, it's not, if it was quality reforms, we'd find the opposite effect, right? So methodologically, we've kind of nailed what's going on, which is recency effects. What you do about that, you know, that's a much harder question, right? And that's kind of, you know, that's it's politics, right? What have you done for me lately, right? That's really that's a tough one.
Thanks. And last comment, I wouldn't recommend you to represent Ukrainians like that police officers are liked in Ukraine by that statue that you made selfie with, because it's kind of controversial. It was presented on the birthday of one of the top rank police officers. It looks like kind of made by his vision. Yeah. And it was kind of, I don't know, it's even was taken by tent not to be vandalized by the civic society, so it's kind of cheesy.
It was supposed to be cheesy and ironic.
Yeah.
If it didn't come off as cheesy and ironic, I'm going to drop it.
Yeah, thank you.
That's helpful. I mean, it really made me smile when I saw the statue. I thought it was pretty funny. But.
Thank you very much for your lecture. Sorry. My name is Roslav. I have two technical questions. Sorry if these questions too critical. So first, it's about the methodology, how you measure a perception of the police reform in Ukraine. So in your study, you attributed this reform with presidential team, with president, but at that times in Ukraine, we had a kind of duality in power. We had coalition, and we have very strong force, People's Front Party, with the Prime Minister Arseniy Yatsenyuk. So I didn't saw in the presentation, maybe you mentioned this in the article, maybe people associated successful of this reform with the Prime Minister and with this party. So if not, can you comment how this could bias your research? And second, it's also about measurement. So maybe this perception of this reform was due media campaign in our mass media, but not like actual like events on the street. So people were not purely fair in their judgment. So maybe their opinion was led by media. So thank you very much.
That's great. No, this is really helpful. There's never an overly critical question. You're right about the sort of dual power at the time, and we don't. I should show the results for the Prime Minister. We don't show them. We essentially found that the people associated much more with the presidency than with them. So the results that we show for the Parliament more broadly, that's what the PM results look like. I should definitely show those separately. That's a really good point. And why that is, of course, is to do with political focus, I guess, and the relative standing of these different institutions in the popular consciousness, I suppose. In terms of the media effects, we find very clear media effects. We find that people who consume TV news daily are much more affected than people who don't, right? So that, again, there is this, you're right, it is a media perception effect. People are much more aware of the reforms happening. They're more aware. There was as someone mentioned, a lot of hoopla around it, right? Big PR campaign, lots of nice pictures, kiss a policeman, these kinds of things, right? So the media effects are really substantial. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for the questions. Behind you.
I have a brief question. When you asked about the media, did you only ask about the TV or also, I don't know, like online media, Facebook, social media, something? Thanks.
Yeah, we asked about social media, we asked about newspapers. And what tends to happen with media is that people who consume a lot of TV also consume a lot of news online. So like, I rephrase that. People who consume a lot of news on TV also consume news online. People who watch a lot of TV but don't consume any news don't necessarily collect news on the internet either, right? So what you end up with is usually pretty high correlation between news consumption of all sources. People are news junkies or they're not news junkies, right? And so if you watch a lot of news on television, there's a tendency to also do it online. It's a little bit age adjusted, so older people maybe a little bit less. Although even that over time is kind of, that is going away, that difference. So yeah, we did, and the effects are kind of similar.
I'll get one more question with regard to the means and ways to tackle corruption. It is a, well, widely accepted in the scientific community assumption that one of the effective ways to decrease corruption, or at least the perception of corruption by the people who are working for the government in some particular sphere, is to increase their pay, to increase their wages.
Right.
And some people do find correlation, some researchers do find correlation, it's quite stable. But at the same time, I also read in one particular research that what also matters is the increase across the different government sectors. Because if the increase is not proportionate, and in one sector it increases disproportionately to the others, then it might reinforce corruption out of, you know, this difference between the sectors. So that in one sector, which is not very, you know, high-paying, those workers, they will be thinking, oh, damn, those guys in that agency, they're getting paid more, and they're gonna be very much upset. My question to you is, do you believe that the way of increasing wages for government workers is viable here in Ukraine? And do you agree with the researchers that this correlation is as high as they think it is? So that this is one of the determining factors, because I suppose when I read it, they really believe that this is like a prime factor, actually. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't know is the answer. I share some of your skepticism, though. I have found that you know, high-paid officials are big supporters in increasing their salaries, right? And they think that's a good solution. And I can follow the logic, right? There is a logic to it, and you definitely don't want public officials to be in, you know, a position of poverty. You know, there's a famous comedy of the only honest policeman in Russia, right? And you know, everyone thinks he's an idiot and he lives in poverty, and you know, that sort of thing is true, right? Like, you can't afford to pay public sector workers, you know, starvation wages. So you have to pay them wages that they can actually live on. Otherwise, you know, what do you expect, right? But perceptions of fairness also matter enormously. I mean, people, you know, in any workplace, if you feel like you're underpaid, it's a very negative incentive for good performance, and especially if you feel like somebody doing the same job is being paid more than you are. And so I think attention not just to levels, but to relative levels between government workers and private sector, and then within the government sector too, is also really important.
Yeah, I want to add to this topic. If we raise wages to politicians in society, still exists this stereotype that politics is for bad people. Politics is always bad.
Right.
Don't get in touch with politics if you want to, I don't know, rest in peace and live in heaven after death. I don't know. Good people stay out of politics, and bad go to politics, and then we receive what we receive. If we raise the pay in politics, media immediately start to bullying them, because wait, they steal from us, but we raise them wages? What? My question is how we can avoid this situation happening, get rid of corruption, but still limit influence of media, bad influence of media. So I don't know, maybe media show us more of good pictures of changes than bad. I don't know if it's possible.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, so this whole issue of the media and negative perceptions and how closely people's perceptions are tied to media it's a hard one. It's a really hard one, especially in contexts in which freedom of the press is not long-standing and it's not really well institutionalized, right? And so that's a really tough one. I think in terms of the salary issue, the key is not so much paying politicians more, but government employees, state workers. That's more where the corruption issues. You'll never compete with a salary for a member of parliament with the kinds of corrupt deals that could be offered, right? Like there are different orders of magnitude. And so that's not a thing that you can address with salary increases, I don't think.
Thanks.
Yeah. We're good? Thank you so much, everybody. I've really enjoyed it. It's been really fun to talk to you.